I once had a chilling experience at a bus stop that I'll never forget. It was a cold, moonless night, and I was waiting for the last bus to take me home. The bus stop was a dimly lit, eerie place that always made me feel uncomfortable. But that night, things took a turn for the worse. As I waited on the empty platform, a gust of wind sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced around, and in the dim light, I could barely make out a few other passengers huddled together, seeking shelter from the biting cold. The atmosphere was heavy with an unspoken tension, and the silence felt oppressive. I decided to strike up a conversation with the person nearest to me, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard. He introduced himself as John, and shared that he'd been waiting for the bus for hours. He seemed uneasy, constantly glancing over his shoulders as if expecting someone or something to jump out at him. It was a subtle hint that this night was far from ordinary. As I chatted with John, a young woman, Emily, joined our conversation. She had a terrified look in her eyes and told us that she'd been at this bus stop for the past 3 nights waiting for her missing friend. Her voice trembled as she described how her friend had disappeared without a trace, and she was convinced something terrifying had happened. We offered our sympathy and support, but the unease seemed to deepen. More people started to gather at the bus stop, all with their own strange and disturbing stories. There was a sense of shared fear, a collective belief that something unexpected was about to happen. As we waited for the bus, time seemed to stretch on endlessly. The cold wind howled, and the night grew darker. The only illumination came from a flickering streetlight. Suddenly, we heard a soft, eerie whisper coming from the darkness beyond the bus stop. The words were indistinct, but it sounded like a ghostly chant. A hushed silence fell over the group as we strained to hear. The whispering grew louder, and it was clear that it was getting closer. As the chanting became more audible, we realized it was a chorus of eerie voices singing an otherworldly melody. Fear spread through the group, and people began to scramble, desperate to escape the sinister sound. But there was nowhere to run. The bus was our only way out, and it was nowhere in sight. Suddenly, Emily's face turned ashen, and she screamed. "That's her voice! That's my friend's voice!" Her friend's voice, now an eerie, haunting chorus, seemed to be coming from all directions. It sent a chill down our spines, as we were trapped in a nightmare that we couldn't escape. We huddled together, fearing what might emerge from the darkness. The chanting voices grew louder and more malevolent, and the air felt charged with an ominous energy. The bus stop had transformed into a terrifying battleground between the living and the unknown. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the chanting stopped. The eerie silence that followed was even more unsettling. We were left in an agonizing state of uncertainty, not knowing what had just transpired. Minutes that felt like hours passed, and finally, the distant headlights of the bus appeared on the dark road. We rushed aboard the bus, desperate to escape the bus stop and its haunting secrets. To this day, I can't forget that night at the bus stop. It was a bone-chilling experience that left me with a deep sense of dread and an unsettling feeling that some mysteries are better left unsolved. One foggy evening, I found myself waiting at a desolate bus stop in a small, remote town. The bus was late, and the only company I had was the persistent drizzle and the soft hum of the streetlight above. I felt like I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick forests that concealed secrets and mysteries. As I stood there, I noticed an elderly woman sitting on one of the benches. She had a distant, vacant look in her eyes, and appeared to be muttering to herself. I decided to strike up a conversation to pass the time and perhaps bring some comfort to her lonely vigil. The woman introduced herself as Margaret, and told me she'd been waiting at this very bus stop for over 40 years. Her story sent a shiver down my spine, as the town had no record of any bus route operating for such a long time. Margaret's story grew even more unsettling. She claimed to be waiting for a bus that would never come, the ghostly number 13, which had ceased running decades ago. Her voice trembled as she spoke, and I could see fear in her eyes. She told me that every evening as the fog rolled in, she could hear the distant rumble of the phantom bus approaching. I tried to console Margaret, thinking she was suffering from dementia or delusions. But then I heard it too, a faint, ghostly sound in the distance, like the rumble of an old engine. I watched in disbelief as the mist parted and a decrepit, rust-covered bus came into view. The bus was a relic from another era, with faded advertisements for products that no longer existed. It stopped with a creaking jolt, and the door slowly opened. I was paralyzed with fear, as the driver was an emaciated figure with hollow eyes and a tattered uniform. He never said a word, just gestured for Margaret to board. Margaret stood up and entered the bus. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her, and the bus rumbled away into the fog, vanishing as mysteriously as it appeared. I was left standing at the empty bus stop. Minutes that felt like hours passed, and the regular bus finally arrived, snapping me out of my trance. I boarded, unable to shake off the eerie experience I had just witnessed. I couldn't find any record of a phantom bus or the number 13, but I knew I'd been an unwilling witness to something inexplicable. The encounter with Margaret and the spectral bus haunted my thoughts for weeks. To this day, I can't forget that foggy evening and the unsettling encounter with Margaret and the phantom bus. I once had a chilling experience at a desolate bus stop on the outskirts of town. It was a night I'll never forget, and it's a story I find difficult to recount. I had just finished a late shift at work, and it was past midnight when I found myself waiting for the last bus home. The bus stop was located at a remote intersection far from any signs of civilization. The area was dimly lit, and the silence was unsettling, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I was not alone at the bus stop that night. A few other people, strangers to me, were waiting as well. A sense of unease settled in as we exchanged nervous glances. I tried to focus on my phone, scrolling through messages to pass the time. As the minutes turned into what felt like hours, a thick fog rolled in, obscuring our surroundings. The bus was late, and a growing sense of anxiety permeated the small group of waiting passengers. One man, dressed in tattered clothes and with a wild look in his eyes, began muttering to himself. His words were incoherent, but his demeanor was unsettling. The others and I exchanged worried glances, keeping our distance. Just then, the distant sound of an approaching bus engine offered some relief. The dim headlights cut through the fog, revealing the shape of the bus. We watched with a sense of hope as it pulled up to the stop, its doors hissing open. The bus driver, an elderly man with a grizzled appearance, greeted us with a weary smile. He must have sensed our anxiety as he assured us that we'd be on our way shortly. I was relieved to step onto the bus, and I wasn't alone in feeling that way. The other passengers quickly boarded as well. The bus was eerily empty, and I couldn't help but wonder why. The driver explained that it had been a slow night with fewer passengers than usual. I sat near the front, close to the driver, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in since I arrived at the bus stop. As the bus started moving, the passengers glanced around nervously. The fog outside grew denser, making it impossible to see anything beyond the bus windows. The silence on the bus was broken only by the rhythmic hum of the engine. It was then that I noticed something unsettling. The man in tattered clothes who had been muttering to himself at the bus stop was now sitting in the back of the bus, staring intently at the rest of us. His wild eyes seemed to glow in the dim interior, and the atmosphere on the bus became even more tense. I looked to the driver for reassurance, but his expression had grown somber. He glanced at the man in the back and then back at me, shaking his head as if to signal that he couldn't do anything. Suddenly, the man leaped up and rushed toward the front of the bus, wielding a sharp object. Panic swept over the passengers, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The driver slammed on the brakes, causing the bus to skid to a stop. The man lunged at the driver, stabbing at him with a sharp object. A struggle ensued, and the bus swerved dangerously. Passengers screamed, trying to get out of the way of the violent altercation. As the bus careened through the fog, the driver lost control. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the sound of screeching metal and shattering glass. I woke up in a daze, disoriented and in pain. The bus was lying on its side, its windows shattered and its interior in shambles. Groaning in pain, I crawled out of the wreckage, and the chilling sight that met my eyes made me shudder. The man who had attacked the driver was gone, leaving behind a grisly scene. The driver lay lifeless, his eyes open in a vacant stare, blood pooling around him. Several passengers were injured, some seriously, their moans and cries filling the night air. We called for help, and soon emergency services arrived at the crash site. The injured passengers were rushed to the hospital, and I was one of them. I was lucky to escape with minor injuries, but the mental scars of that horrific night run deep. The man who had caused the crash was never found. The police searched for him, but he seemed to have vanished into thin air. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been something otherworldly, something beyond explanation. To this day, I can't forget the terrifying events at that remote bus stop, and I avoid traveling alone at night.